Okay, it's with enormous pleasure that Radical Anthropology Group is introducing Louise, the author of a book called Striking a Light, which is one of the main histories of the Matchwomen strike of 1888, the Bryant and May girls' strike. This might seem, for those of you who've been at RAG before or just learned about it as Radical Anthropology Group, it might seem that this is a bit of a new departure to have sort of a lecture which is really about the history of gender and working class movement of the late 19th century. However, clearly from the first couple of lectures, we have been building a picture that the emergence of human culture had something to do with the single sort of law, commandment of never cross a picket line as the source of the sacred and the source of human culture itself. So that solidarity, human solidarity, was born in that context, in that space. So we think there are potential connections. So
good, let's hope so.
Hand over to Louise to tell us about it.
And thank you, Camilla, for wearing the T-shirt of the festival.
Yeah,
I'm very impressed with that. That was my first Matchwomen festival last year. I'm not going to insist that everywhere I go now people wear the T-shirt. I think that's brilliant. So yes, the Victorians, bless them, they invented a lot of things. Of course, the things that you learn about at school, the steam trains and the bikes and the cars and all that kind of stuff. But also a new kind of sexism, which was really kind of them. They invented what I call the modern bad girl. Some of the ideas that we still live with today, as women and as men, about gender, are hangovers from the Victorian period. Because the modern bad girl, the problem with women like the Matchwomen, the problem with factory workers, is they're having really basically too much fun. They're working class and yet they're doing all the wrong things. They're apparently having sex. I think we have to, when we talk about it, to say sex a bit like, who was it now? Not Les. Yeah, who was the comedian who used to, anyway, never mind, it's completely gone. Les Dawson, when he was gossiping over the garden fence. That's very much the way the Victorians saw it. So this was your modern bad girl. This is what Victorians were worried about, that people were having the wrong sort of fun, too much sex, drinking too much, basically enjoying themselves too much, whilst being working class, which wasn't really acceptable at the time. The Victorians were very peculiar about sex. They were a bit weird about it. That's an academic phrase, weird about it. And they were obsessed with it. They studied it and wrote about it, but at the same time, of course, ignored it, tried to rather pretend it wasn't happening, or that it shouldn't be happening, or that it didn't exist. A lot was at stake for them, of course, because they thought that sex with the wrong person could lead to the downfall of the race, no less, not just sort of a bad morning the next day, a bit of regret. But the downfall of the race, because of eugenics, which was a massively popular, the Nazis' favourite pseudoscience, of course, very popular at this time. And, amongst people on the left as well as people on the right, surprisingly, they were all massive fans of eugenics. So here was this idea that the women of the East End and the women of the poor parts of Britain had the potential to destroy the nation by luring decent men, the poor chaps who were trying to get home to their wives, being lured into dens of vice and sex and drugs and music hall, which was a very, very bad thing. And it says a reaction to this I discovered when I was looking into the story of this strike, and specifically I was looking at why the version of the strike that I uncovered fairly quickly as a trade union officer who was researching was not the version that was in the history books. It was a far more important event than had been said, than I had learned. The reasons for this are so interesting, and the gender norms that were being created at this time tell us everything we need to know about why this has for a long time been considered a fairly insignificant, small strike, sort of nothing to see here, move along to the Great Dock Strike of 1889, do not stop at the Matchwomen strike. I think because new gender norms are being created at this time, and we're getting the idea, you're right, I've got something to say, there's a chair over there, we're getting the idea here that a woman's place is in the home. That's a new idea, and that's surprising really, because we think of it as one that's always been around, it's just an old-fashioned idea. But actually it's new. The Victorians have come up with this as a reaction to what's happening in society and in work with industrialisation. was easy enough to dismiss the idea of women's labour as threatening to the status quo when women were mostly working in agricultural conditions, with their husbands, with their fathers, working in family groups and not getting their own wages. That was one thing. It was accepted in 100 years before this time that every woman worked, apart from the aristocracy, and that if you were going to find a good husband, you needed to be able to work as well. So that was a gender norm for women at the time. But then suddenly women's work becomes a bit more visible and scary visible for a lot of the middle and upper class Victorians. You have women on the streets of towns and cities like London, but all over the world, who are all over the country, who are working in factories perhaps, who are working independently from their menfolk, oh dear, and they're parading around in noisy girl gangs, it's all a bit much. They're getting their own money, and what are they going to do with it? To the Victorians, these are basically children in terms of their intellect, the real underclass, the working class, the chavs of the day. God forbid they should have, their own money and their own funds to spend without male supervision. It's all going to, everything's going to hell in a handbasket, basically. So this is helped along. It's amazing how strongly this idea is put across. If you look at really respectable reports written by commissioners, industrial commissioners at the time, you can see this dual idea about working class women as being a bit sexy and a bit scary, and sort of slightly slutty and no better than they should be, really rather dangerous. There's one, my absolute favourite one, is a mining commissioner in the 1840s. He's talking about women working down a mine, and women in those days would crawl along pulling coal carts which were chained around their waists, down a mine shaft, and obviously you would take your bonnet off, wouldn't you, and your white gloves. You're not going to be dressed in your full sort of Bond Street rig out, and they would be sometimes stripped to the waist. But these labour reports have illustrations which are a little bit superfluous, frankly, of these women, crawling around. It's all one a bit 50 Shades of Grey, and it's all made to look rather more erotic than I imagine it actually was if you were that woman down that mine. So this mining commissioner says, any sight more disgustingly revolting or indecent than these girls at work cannot be imagined. No brothel can beat it. Which makes you wonder how he did his research. I wonder if Mrs. Mining Commissioner perhaps had something to say when she read that. George? But this is the idea that's being put across, that these are scary, terrifying, loose, immoral, kind of almost feral. They're not like middle class women and upper class women. They're not like real human beings. They're a bit of a frightening subgroup. And there's an image here which I like, which sums up very much.
There's a chair here, chair there, chair there. There's 4 chairs around here, just enough for everyone.
Shut the door downstairs.
You want me to shut the door downstairs?
Sorry.
I can shout.
Tell them the racket and try to get in.
There's a chair here, chair here.
I can just talk
One
louder.
over there.
That's, I think that's the
Sorry, do you mind if I sit next to you?
Oh, I see.
one there.
Somebody said that there's a lot of noise coming from downstairs. Is it really?
I can talk louder.
I could shut the door, but the trouble is people might think we're not
I can talk like, can everyone hear me, by the way? I should have asked in the beginning, really. Just go like that if you can't. So this is an image that I absolutely love. This is from Punch. And this is a bit of an awkward moment in a marriage, I'm sorry to tell you. Here is our Victorian gentleman and his wife taking a stroll through perhaps Covent Garden. And he, unfortunately, is being accosted by this young flower seller, who's obviously gone, oh, hello, George, or similar. And it's captioned in the original, George, this young person appears to know you. He's got an awkward few days ahead of him. He's got some explaining to do. But it's very significant that she's got her basket of flowers too. She's working. So this is where the euphemism working girl comes from, by the way, to mean prostitute, because the lines are getting really, really blurred between the two. In fact, a woman who did a really interesting study of Victorian fiction and the kind of sensationalist novels that are really popular at this period, said it was easier for a novelist to make a female heroine, if you wanted people to sympathise with her, a prostitute than a factory girl. factory girls were just beyond the pale. They were absolutely the worst. Prostitutes, at least you knew where you were with them. But your factory girls, it's just absolutely terrifying. Now, real life, of course, is a little bit different for working class women in the streets of London and the East End than this sort of non-stop sexy good time that the middle classes are imagining them having. That's a typical scene in an East End slum tenement. That's a family. The whole family living in one room. They're all working. Only the dad would have been recorded on the census as a tailor, but you can see that they're all working. And you can see there's beds as well, there and there. So in your one room, you're sleeping, eating, working, and doing everything impossible to keep it clean. And you've got a fire in the corner. And people were very often sharing accommodation with somebody who died as well. You could save up for a funeral. You quite often have granny or granddad deceased in the corner as well. So absolutely horrific living conditions. And the Victorians do quite an interesting thing. They're very capable of holding a lot of contradictory and strange opinions at once, the Victorians. I suppose future generations would say the same about us. But they like to blame the poor for being poor, as if it's a bit of a lifestyle choice. So you've got your deserving poor and your undeserving poor. Some might say the government at the moment, I'm not going to comment at all about the Daily Mail or anything the Tories do. But, this is really where this idea starts. There's such inequality. It's become so obvious once it's moved into the city streets. A lot different when they're all starving quietly in the countryside, but suddenly they're all there right in front of you. You have to be able to justify that to yourself somehow. So it's easier to say, well, they're all feckless and they're all doing this rather than what they're actually doing. They're all down the pub and then look at them, what a shower, and there's children in there and they're all drinking and this is why they're poor.
Tavern.
Sorry? It could well be, couldn't it, actually? What if it says it there? But it could well be, yes. Could be, any scene. And, the pubs were really popular in those days, and it's not surprising because the gin palaces, the really fancy ones that come in at this period, have got gaslight, they've got cheap food, it's a lot cleaner and more pleasant than your one room with granny dead in the corner, plus, a bit of beer to take the edge off. You can't really blame people that are working a 16-hour day. But women drinking as well, this is all really bad. Well, your average Victorian woman at this time, it's non-stop childbirth and work, really. That's about your lot for anybody working class. 10 live births is your average as a Victorian woman, and that's live births, but doesn't count stillbirths and miscarriages. So it's most of your life pregnant and then working in between. And working in factories, and at the same time you get this bizarre thing starts to happen that I've studied with sort of incomprehension, that men who become the new capitalists, who have enough money to start up factories, are capable of real social movement, which hadn't really been the case before for working class men. So they then start to become the hegemonic class. They set the rules, they start to define behaviour. And what they do is to take from the aristocracy the idea of the lady of leisure. They think they like that idea. They dismiss the aristocratic idea, obviously, that gentlemen don't work because that doesn't suit them and that trade is a terrible thing. So that's gone, but they like this idea of the lady of leisure. So they adopt that for themselves to define their own class. It becomes a mark of status for the working class and the middle class and the upper classes, that your wife, your daughters don't have to work. So you've got men who are going into factories where, in some cases, 75% of the labour is female, women with the backbone of the Industrial Revolution. In all the key industrialised industries, we couldn't have industrialised without women's labour. So they're going to work, making profit from women's labour so that they can go home and say no decent woman works. But then the Victorians, as I say, were entirely capable of that, quite happily housing contradictions like that. And then, of course, you've got good old Queen Vicky on the throne with her, who's kept count of numerous children, and doing the whole wifey thing. Even after Prince Albert dies, that doesn't interrupt her sort of wifeliness, and she sort of mourns him for the rest of her life. And she is not your biggest feminist, isn't Queen Victoria? In fact, she says that feminists ought to be horsewhipped. The fact that she's an empress seems to have passed everybody by when they're saying, this is the perfect woman, this is the perfect devoted wife and mother at home, and running an empire. But only when the kids are in bed, so, presumably that's fine. But she constantly, Queen Victoria, plays up this idea that women are poor and feeble, and she's terribly delicate. And so this whole idea at this time gets us into a real ideological mess about gender. And we would get the idea that's become known as the angel in the house. I don't know if anybody's read the poem by Coventry Patmore, The Angel in the House. You kind of have my sympathies. It goes on a bit, doesn't it? It's a very sort of moving hymn of praise to the perfect feminine woman who devotes herself entirely to her husband and her home, and that's her role in life, is to please her man, and that's her central pleasure in life. And apparently based on his wife Emily Patmore, who died young, and you can't help saying, who can blame her? In my case, I've had to listen to too much of that. But that's what we're left with, the angel in the house idea. And Virginia Woolf writes about, it's an essay by her that I love, which started as a talk she gave in the 1920s. She talked about this idea, and she was talking to younger women and saying, now you won't be stuck with all this angel in the house nonsense, but my generation and before had this handed down from the Victorians. This idea should even I, of course Virginia Woolf had servants, she was middle class and well off, when I'm writing, when I'm working, I have the angel in the house, and she imagines her like this sort of malevolent little imp on her shoulder saying, have the men had enough to eat? And should you be doing this? Isn't it a bit selfish? Does the floor need cleaning? Does cooking need supervising? And she has to finish off the angel with an ink pot and sort of bludgeon her to death. But she imagined this is an idea which is going away and which won't make much sense to her young audience now. Women here might beg to differ. There's still, I think, a pretty large issue about domestic ideology. That's what it was known as. But it became incredibly popular. And with people from all different interest groups, this idea of domestic ideology, get the little ladies away from the factory, get them back to the home, and everything will be all right. Working class men adopt this a bit as well. Trade unionists, funnily enough, adopt this. And you wouldn't necessarily think that that would make much sense. But because women are paid so much less, employers can bring them in. Employers can bring them in as cheap labour, and obviously that's a threat to the male workers, and even though that might be your wife or your daughter in some cases, you've got two choices. You either organise alongside women and fight for equal pay, which some did, by the way, or you try to keep women out of the workforce, and a lot did that as well. And a lot of the main established trade unions at this time, which are not like trade unions today, on the whole, they're much more sort of boys' clubs about keeping labour price high and keeping apprenticeships so that you limit entry into the profession. So they're not really what we think of as trade unions today. In some cases, though, some are. So what's really happening, we were talking about the reality of working class life, it's really well illustrated, and people start to wake up to the fact that actually people are working and dying of starvation. People are working full time and dying of starvation. Occasionally something makes the middle and upper classes care briefly about this, a cholera epidemic or something like that, and you get people going philanthropically into the East End and trying to do something about it. But it's very much from the perspective that, bless them, they don't really know how to run their lives, and they really need us to help them. Rather than we need social change, we need economic and political change, it's very much, well, if we teach them how to clean their front doorstep and white lead it and go to church regularly, it'll all be fine. And there's one example, occasionally you get something that breaks through in the papers and causes a bit of a scandal, and this from April 1888, this is before the period of the Matchwomen strike that I'm going to talk about by a few months, is the death of Sophia Hill, who was a seamstress. And the paper says, on the 31st of July, she returned from work feeling very unwell. Her husband had noticed her getting weaker from want of food for some time, but she would not allow him to fetch the relieving officer being the equivalent of benefits, really, which there weren't any in those days. But if you wanted to apply for charitable relief, you could apply to the relieving officer, but that was quite a shameful, it was quite an embarrassing thing to have to do, and she, for whatever reason, wouldn't let her husband do it. Eventually he called in the doctor, which would cost him as well. The doctor prescribed brandy, which they couldn't afford, even if that was going to help her, and she died at 7:30 that day, and Sophia Hill died. So occasionally, events like that do disturb the unquiet conscience of the middle and upper class Victorians. But generally speaking, they do like to write them all off as a bad lot. And the Matchwomen, the reason I'm so interested in them is that they typify all of this. They are the archetypal Victorian bad girls, troublesome working class people. They epitomise all of this. They are Irish. Now this is very bad. If you really have to be a working class Victorian woman who works in a factory, that is bad enough, frankly. But to be Irish as well is just going too far. Irish people, the discrimination you may well know against Irish people who are coming over from Ireland in response to famine and to oppression, political oppression as well. The prejudice was incredible. There was one area of the East End that the police and media called the Fenian Barracks because they thought they were all so political and such terrible Fenians. And they said that Charles Booth, actually, in his Poverty Maps of London, talks about this area and says the police don't even bother trying to arrest people from there. If they're there, just leave. It's fine. Because if you do try to take anyone, if you try to arrest anyone, they just put up barricades immediately and start chucking stuff at you. By stuff, I mean chairs and tables and irons and that kind of thing. Solidarity, some might say, but it didn't go down terribly well. So there, lots of the Irish people I found from the accounts, most of the Matchwomen hailed from the Emerald Isles, one of the Bryant and May Match Factory directors put it, by birth or by lineage. And that puts them in a very politicised community, which has come over with some disaffection, shall we say, for the Brits. They're not exactly universally loving of their hosts, and vice versa. The discrimination is awful. Karl Marx writes about it, actually, says that everyone looks down on someone. We've got that Two Ronnies sketch of I look down on him and I look down on him. And you know, the English proletariat will look down on the Irish. And again, this thing about deserving poor and people choosing to be poor comes into play. And I've read accounts by fairly intelligent Victorian people saying, well, the way the Irish live, I mean, they all live in 20 to a room. It's crazy. As if, you know, they could have a townhouse with 5 bedrooms. They're like, no, you know what? We're fine. We'll all cram into one room with a pig in the corner. It's great. This is how we choose to live. No, you know, no conception at all that they've come over having to leave everything they have behind, perhaps from starvation, and they've had to take whatever accommodation they could. But it's a politicised community too, very strong social networks, not just the Catholic Church, but culturally and politically, you've got a really kind of, I hate the word feisty, but a really, you know, a strongly political community. And although that's an idea that I had to really fight, actually, when I was doing, this started off for me, I was a trade union rep doing an essay on a labour history course. It was supposed to be 1,000 words, about 1,000 years ago as well. And it became a master's degree and a PhD because I discovered that the strike wasn't at all how it had been recorded. But this idea I still had to fight in the 90s, with this idea that the Irish community were quite self-educated and actually quite intelligent and quite politicised. This is quite controversial, even then, believe it or not. Because, of course, a lot of the people couldn't write, so they couldn't write their great works about their political thoughts. But I went back and researched people's childhoods and people's memories, and you find Irish people saying, oh, we sat by the fire every night and we recited, you know, the list of Erin's wrongs, we talked about all our martyrs and we sang the songs. They're terribly romantic, and any child growing up with that heady brew is going to get politicised fairly fast, I would imagine, and women or men. So the Matchwomen, I think that a lot of women like these, and again this was a theory that not all labour historians like to look at with women, was that they had such strong networks at home, why wouldn't they carry them into the factory? They had ways to survive, strategies, as all working class women, working class people had to. You had to get on with your neighbours pretty much all of the time because you didn't know when you were going to be out of work and need to borrow a pot of stew off them or similar. And the people that got on well with their neighbours tended to survive better. This is actually being traced. You needed to get on with the local shopkeepers so you could get your tip, get your credit as well. So it's really important that you have a pretty strong network supporting you. Why wouldn't you take that tradition into the rest of your life as well? Given that if you were working at the Bryant and May factory in Bow in East London, you were going to be working with your friends, with your neighbours, with your sisters and with women that you knew. So we've got, at its peak, 3,000 people working in this factory. somewhere. Yes, there it is. If anyone knows Bow, Fairfield Road, it still looks quite like that, doesn't it, from the outside? But it's a gated community now. It's what we used to call the uppy flats in my youth. And yeah, you can't get in. They've got a beautiful kind of palm trees and stuff there, and they've got these lovely little wrought iron gates there. And you have to actually get in through the security there now. I just took a group there on Saturday to walk and have a look round. This is really Bryant and May saying, we've got a lot of money, we've done incredibly well for ourselves. They come from being grocers, they're Quakers, both the original Mr. Bryant and the original Mr. May are Quakers. A lot of Victorian businessmen are, because Quakers are banned from some of the professions at this time, so a lot go into business. So you've got your Lloyds, your Cadburys, Barclays, and lots of others I can't think of now. But you've got lots of big Quaker families who we still know the names of today. So they buy this factory in 1861, set it up for match production because they've started to do that in England. It was always done in Sweden, but they realised this was a really good way to make money. It's cheap to set up as match production. You just need some white phosphorus and some wood and some cheap labour, and you're pretty much done. And they start to concentrate exclusively on this around the 1870s. By the 1880s, the original Mr. Bryant and Mr. May have gone. The Bryant sons are in control. The Mays, who seem to have been a bit nicer, really, if I had to pick a side over Bryant and May, I would go for the Mays. But they've been forced out by the Bryants. And the Bryants are incredibly ruthless. I've spent a lot of time in their company archives, more time than is good for anyone. But they really are like modern capitalists. They've got ruthless in their attention to public relations. They're constantly having journalists around the factories showing them all these lovely sights and happy matchwomen going, oh, God bless you, sir, we love working here. They're constantly schmoozing politicians. They've really got their PR and their marketing sorted very well, and also their ruthless pursuit of profit, about which we'll hear more. So they're employing these women who are supposed to be, you know, they're largely literate. They're from 11 years old. Some are even younger, and that's really quite common. Bryant, one of the Bryants, was actually interviewed by the Sweating Commissioner. He was asked about child labour, and he said, well, I'm really annoyed about all this. What really bugs me, I'm paraphrasing slightly, is that we have to send some of our children to school half the time. It's ridiculous. Completely interrupts the working day. And they love working for us because really it's like playing with the lovely white phosphorus. Brilliant. And he said, I consider that 80 is a very good age to start work. So this is the kind of lovely Victorian philanthropists we have on our hands with them. So they're employing 3,000 people. Some are boys and men, most are women and girls. They're mostly EastEnders. And EastEnder, now there's another strike against the matchwomen. EastEnder starts to be used at this time. No one has said the East End much before the 1880s, East London or wherever it happens to be. Of course, it's massively, the population has swollen massively with industrialisation, and East End is an insult. It first comes into use in musical songs around the 1880s, and it's a slap-bang insult. If you call someone an East Ender, that is fighting talk. Somebody said at this period, if you've got a respectable poor person from another part of London, then fair enough, you know, you've got to watch them obviously, but they might be all right. But if you've got an EastEnder over the threshold, lock up the spoons and reach for the bug powder, which kind of really says it all. And of course, as people do, they start to turn that round and call themselves EastEnders and appropriate it as a badge of pride and as an identity in itself. But at this time, it's really completely an insult. So, matchwomen, EastEnders, Irish, and women, and working women as well. They've really got everything against them. And Bryant and May, these incredibly well-connected, incredibly wealthy employers. So it doesn't look as if they stand a chance when, in 1888, they go on strike. And this is them. You may have seen this picture. It's the one that usually gets trotted out. This is them outside the factory gates on strike in early July in 1888. These women, I think, are quite significant to the story. I started to look at this picture and wonder who they were, because they're never named. In traditional histories, they're just the match girls. They're this kind of undifferentiated mass of girls. But that's okay, because in the traditional version of events, they're led, thank goodness, by a nice middle-class person, who comes down in a nice dress and tells them that they're going on strike and everything's fine. Now this woman is Annie Besant. I think I've got a picture of Annie striking a pose somewhere. Yes, there's Annie. Annie Besant is a Fabian. We could argue all night about whether they were socialists or not, but they regarded themselves as socialists in perhaps a slightly more gentle way than a lot of Marxists would have done. Annie, I'm trying to be polite because I wasn't offending people if I'm not careful. So Annie is the ex-wife of a clergyman, and she's come back to the East End. She's really well known, by the way. She's a celebrity socialist, much as George Bernard Shaw was, with whom she was also a key favourite. They may or not have been close. I'm not one to gossip. There were rumours, I don't know, but they were at one time working very closely together in any case. She's well known because she gets involved with birth control for the poor, which is quite an important issue at the time. She republishes a pamphlet written by a doctor several years beforehand that was called The Fruits of Philosophy, a guide for married people. It's a birth control booklet, basically. And she gets put on trial in the Old Bailey for obscene libel. Now, the press absolutely love that. The press at this time have started to become the sort of press we recognise because of the freeing up of newspaper tax. So there's newspapers everywhere, and there's quite sensationalist stories are starting to appeal. So the attractive, separated wife of a clergyman on trial for obscene libel, brilliant. They absolutely love it. Plus, she's on trial alongside Charles Bradlaugh, who's an MP who's married, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, but very close to Annie, and he's an atheist. So he's like one of the most feared men in Britain, which title gets given out quite regularly, Karl Marx as well. And he refused to swear an oath on the Bible when he took office as MP. So this is, you can imagine the press are absolutely loving this. Annie defends herself, and actually they are just about let off and spared imprisonment. So she's famous at this point. She's well recognisable. There is a lot of political life in the East End. On Sundays, there's not much on telly. So on Sundays, what they tend to do, EastEnders isn't on, yeah. What they tend to do is have enormous processions about political matters from the East End, particularly from the dock areas around the East End. And Irish Home Rule is a really popular one to protest about, and often Annie Besant will speak about that, so she's quite recognisable to the media and also, it turns out, to the Matchwomen. So she's at a Fabian meeting in June 1888. They're discussing female labour in the East End and the exploitation thereof. And somebody, it's unclear who, somebody says, well, what about Bryant and May? What about the match factory? I've heard that since they became made a firm 4 years ago and shares were issued, their shareholders are getting 20% returns on their dividends, which is pretty good. But their workers are on starvation wages. And, you know, somebody needs to investigate this. So Annie pops along. She's got her own political paper called The Link, and she pops down to the factory gates and talks to 6 of the girls, and I think that's why these women are always photographed, because I think they're the 6. Amongst them, I think, are the women who spoke to her and became very active in what happened next. And they tell her about their lives behind this quite cuddly image that Bryant and May have, and totally ubiquitous. You wouldn't find a home without a Bryant and May matchbox in those days. You needed matches for everything. You had no hot water, no cooking, no, nothing, no light without matches. And Bryant and May made the most popular type as well, which is called a Lucifer. If anybody knows this song, Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag. I'm not going to sing it, people get nervous, but if anybody wants to, do. There's a line, while you've got a Lucifer to light your fag, smile boys smile. Very popular type of match. It's made with white phosphorus, which is such a toxic chemical, it's now banned as a weapon of war. You can't kill people in war with white phosphorus, because it's fine for this lot to be dipping matches into, it's fine. So the Lucifer match is one that you can strike anywhere, and pubs like this in those days used to have Lucifer match strikes scored all over the walls, because you could strike them literally anywhere. Didn't need to carry your box and your striking strip with you. Men liked to strike them on their boots and be a bit cooler. Strike them on their thighs, apparently, was what went on in those days. But apparently also, yeah, there's a lot of jokes, but we'll leave them all there. So this is the most popular match. Doesn't have to be used, by the way. White phosphorus is really important to remember. White phosphorus was not essential to match production. You could use red phosphorus, which is a lot safer. But Bryant and May said, making the business case, as you know, companies do, is what the punters want. That's what they want. You know, if that's what they want, that's what we've got to give them. And what it in fact led to, as they knew very well, was phosphorus. And where's the picture gone? What are you doing? Okay, where's my technical support? Does anybody know how to get back? I want to get to phosphorus necrosis, which is number 8, and I've done something ridiculous.
Kind of technical.
Done something ridiculous to the computer. But you might have heard people talk about phossy jaw if they talk about the Matchwomen strike. There we go. Yeah. Just keep going on. And there it is. There's this poor chap here. As you can see, his jawbone has decayed completely with necrosis caused by the phosphorus. And what would happen was made worse in the Bryant and May factory because there was no ventilation, and that was absolutely key to have ventilation because the phosphorus fumes otherwise are circulating everywhere. And also there was no separate workroom. Now there should have been, because matchmaking was a dangerous trade under the Factory Acts, and they needed a separate dining room, but Bryant and May weren't about to waste money on that when there were profits to consider. So what you would do if you were a match worker was you would take your bit of bread in from home, and that's what you would live on. The wages were that low that you'd be living on bread and tea, and that would be it for every meal. You'd leave it on your workbench, and by the time you come to eat it, the phosphorus particles in the air have settled on your bread. You're going to have holes in your teeth and missing teeth. The phosphorus works its way into your jawbone and starts to decay the jawbone while you're still alive, so your bones are actually decaying from the inside out. Bits of bone the size of peas apparently were passed through huge abscesses. And the saddest, I think one of the saddest things is the odour apparently was so unbearable that family members got ostracised, and they'd be found by factory inspectors later on living almost like lepers on the outskirts of towns and cities in the last stage of the disease. Incredibly painful death as well. It's an absolutely horrible thing, is phossy jaw, and that's what it does to a jawbone. You can see all the teeth are gone on that side, and the jawbone's completely decayed. I do talk to a school though, and there's always somebody who spoils the moment, and this kid said, well, you said they were poor, miss, but they must have got a lot of money from the tooth fairy. Very inappropriate indeed. But yeah, absolutely horrible condition and completely unnecessary. If you go into the Bryant and May match factory, if you sneak past security, they've got a big plaque on the wall talking about the story. It's a beautifully sanitised version of events saying how lovely Bryant and May were really, and a lovely picture of a gleaming dentist's chair and dentist surgery saying they had a company dentist. Yes, once they were absolutely forced to by the law they did. But in these days, in the 1880s, they'd sacked you. That was their precaution. If you looked a bit swollen of jaw, they sacked you because then your death would not be recorded on their statistics. They also get sued later, even after the strike, for concealing instances of phossy jaw, so they're really not particularly bothered. But the women would conceal it if they had toothache and a swollen jaw. They're really, really sad. Even though they knew what it was, they knew really well what it was, they would conceal it with a scarf or a muffler, because although it was going to kill them, it was going to kill them slower than starvation. So they needed to keep working for as long as they could. William Morris, who of course was a well-known socialist on the scene at this period when he wasn't doing the wallpaper, talks about this, and he says that he'd heard that one woman who was pregnant was told by Bryant and May to go at her own expense and have all her teeth pulled without anaesthetic in those days, or be sacked, and she said, I'm not going to risk my baby, so she was sacked. That was the caring, sharing employer's approach in those days. And of course, forget about compensation or sickness pay, you were just out, you were just unemployed. They had no trade union, they had no contracts of employment. So when they first walk out on strike and they're parading the streets of the East End, they're outside the factory gates. This is what becomes the strike committee. That's Annie Besant there, and that's not a very butch match girl. People often ask me that. That's actually a man. It's Herbert Burrows of the Fabian Society, token man in the picture. This is the strike committee meeting to hand out money. But they walk out because Annie Besant produces an article about what these women have told her about phossy jaw, also about how low their wages are, and she says you can immediately see it when you look at the girls. They're starving, they're malnourished, even the working class women and girls at the time. They're really thin and pale and frail looking. In fact, she finds out that wages are lower in 1888 than they had been 100 years earlier. 10 years earlier, not 100 years earlier. Bryant and May, although they would have done that, they could have done as well. Bryant and May pushed them down so low, and she said the youngest girls who are earning these starvation wages while they should be growing physically, they should be developing physically, you can just see they're really undersized. They're in a terrible state, basically, due to malnourishment. This article comes out. Bryant and May are predictably not very happy about this blow to their public image, to put it mildly, and they decide to strike, no pun intended, at the workforce. And they put papers in every workroom. It's a huge factory site, by the way. There were 3 separate large factories within the Fairfield Works Match Factory. And in every workroom, the foreman laid down these papers with a printed statement at the top, saying, we love working for Bryant and May. It's fantastic, we couldn't be happier. It's just these socialists coming along and, misleading us. But we don't, basically saying that Annie Besant had lied in her article, that everything that she had said was untrue. Now, they were going to be sacked if they didn't sign it, but they didn't sign it, which is quite impressive, I think. And we know that they didn't do this by accident. And there are Labour historians who really feel that people who are this working class, if they do anything political, it's probably by mistake. It definitely wasn't. They wrote to Annie Besant and they told her specifically, this is one of the few examples of the Matchwomen's words that we know were their words, dear lady, they are trying to get the poor girls to sign a paper to say that it is all lies that you have written, but we will not go back on you. What you have written was quite true, and we thank you for it, and we will not sign. I think it's incredibly touching, because Annie Besant could frankly look after herself, but that was solidarity. They understood that she'd stood up for them, and they were not going to go back on her, even if they all lost their jobs. The next thing that happens is Bryant and May, seeing that this hasn't worked, they pick on one girl. It could be one of the girls here, it could be that girl, I'm not entirely sure yet. But one girl who's very young and who's popular with her workmates, and probably called Eliza, and one of the reports it says has large violet eyes, seems quite fancy her, is sacked. And Bryant and May make an excuse and say she's not doing her work properly, but they all know why she's been sacked. And they all put down their tools and stream out of the factory gates onto Fairfield Road in Bow. By lunchtime, you've got 1,400 people out on the streets. And what do they do then? Well, Labour historians would expect them to probably go down the pub or go home or just sort of wander about confused, thinking, what have we done? But they don't. They organise themselves really quickly and really efficiently. They elect 6 girls, it's roughly 1 from each major work area, to go back to the employers and put their terms. And their terms are interesting because they widen them immediately. It's not just the reinstatement of the one girl. They've immediately asked also for a separate dining room, interestingly, as they know the risks with fussy during food, and the right to form a trade union, which they have no right whatsoever to do. Bryant and May tell them where to go, and are absolutely furious. Incandescent with rage. This is not how things were supposed to pan out for Bryant and May. We're really successful here. We've got mansions. Come on, we're gentlemen. One of us is the sheriff. I always want to say the sheriff of Nottingham, which is so appropriate, but sheriff of Buckinghamshire. This doesn't happen to us, and this is just scum off the streets, basically, that we're out of the goodness of our hearts we're employing, and they've got the temerity to, and they're women. This is what's going on here. This is a very perplexing moment for Bryant and May, and they're not remotely happy. So they say no, they reject them completely, out they go again, and there's one bit of sound archive, unfortunately only that I've ever discovered, and it's a guy being interviewed about street songs of the period, and even though I know he's only being interviewed about that, and even though I know he hardly says anything about the strike, every time I listen to it I think, oh, I'll say something else, and no, he's dead now, I'm not going to ask anything else. But he talks about seeing the strike, and he says these match girls, when they were on strike, they used to parade down the Bow Road, and as they walked, they used to sing, and people would throw down coins from the pubs and the offices, and they'd sing, we're going to hang old Bryant on a sour apple tree. It's not very respectful, is it? It's not, I mean, honestly. No wonder people were horrified, really, by these appalling matchwomen. So this goes on. They are holding meetings on Mile End Waste. They're really super organised. They're collecting funds because there aren't any. Annie Besant, supposedly the strike leader, where is she in all this? Nowhere to be found. But from her own diary, she says she's working in her office and she hears a commotion, looks out the window, sort of bit of a rabble out on the pavement, doesn't know who they are or what they want, asks them, sends someone down with a note, you don't get too involved, send someone down to say who are you and what do you want. sees a couple of them, gives them tea, says they're quite respectable, and they say, well, we're match girls, Mum, and we've gone on strike. And she's horrified, this woman who's been memorialised ever since as a strike leader. Sort of, I can't imagine what she would have said, I know what I would have said, but she's horrified and urges them to go back to work. In her next edition of her paper, banner headline, the girls will go back to work, I hope, please. And she says, really, really clearly, this is a bang out of water idea. There's 1,400 of them, they've got no money. What are we supposed to do? They should have let 1 or 2 of them be sacked because we could have supported them. This is just a disaster, basically. And from an economic standpoint, you can see that. This is alarming. In those days, it isn't what happens. You don't have as Annie Besant later calls people like these, workers like these, the mob of labour, the casual workers. You don't have them going out on strike. You don't want that. That's so terrifying. What you want is arbitration and reasonable behaviour and boycotts by middle-class customers to make employers behave a little bit better. That's all fine. But what you don't want is something which could amount to revolution, and this lot out on the streets of the East End. This is worrying. Police leave is cancelled, so everyone else thinks it's worrying too. Police are rushed into the area just in case it all kicks off with the match girls strike. And the local papers at the time are really quite horrified, and they're saying this is just shocking. Bryant and May are gentlemen. What do they think they're doing? How very dare they do this? And you should see them. They're absolutely, they're scummy types. They're the worst types imaginable parading around the streets. But they don't go back to work. They're absolutely solid. National journalists start covering it. Why? Because the East End is a really popular area of research at this time. Loads of poor people, awful conditions, but really close to Parliament as well. Walking distance, rebelling distance of Parliament too. So it's a very interesting area. And it's been completely deserted by the upper classes, by the gentry, with the advent of steam trains. Anyone who can get out of the East End gets out of the East End and just lets them get on with it, basically, with absolutely no infrastructure whatsoever. Suddenly, the journalists come down, and you can see these poor chaps, and they are chaps, encountering working class women probably for the first time, and they're a bit shocked, really. They're very middle class. You should see these women there. They wear these really strange clothes. They've all got sort of patches on them. It's very odd. And their boots don't match. I think it's a fashion thing. And they're all sort of broken. Yes, they're poor. They really can't quite get their heads around it. But what surprises them more, because they've all read the tales about past London and the terrifying darkened streets and the feral poor people that'll kill you as soon as look at you. And instead, they hear these women supporting each other, making speeches. They see solidarity in action. They hear them saying, oh, I can pawn that for you, or I can lend you that, or I can help you out with some money, or my mum will give you some food. And they're really amazed, supposed to be. This is not all we've been told about the poor. They're expected to be just fighting each other for money. They're not supposed to be capable of any kind of solidarity or any kind of political consciousness at all. What happens then is Bryant and May are still banging on about how ridiculous this all is and how happy their workers actually are. It had not been for the Reds under the beds who are stirring things up. So Toynbee Hall go and investigate. They send independent investigators to look into conditions, and they discover that things are actually a lot worse, Annie Besant said. So in some ways she was inaccurate, but not in a good way for Bryant and May. Things are far worse. Illegal fines are being imposed. One girl talks about being fined when she alters a machine that's cutting, this machine is cutting their fingers, and this one girl talks about having altered it to make it safe. The foreman is furious, he fines her, and he makes her put it back, and he says that machine is worth more than you are. Business case, profit and loss. It's perfectly valid. You hear employers and big companies doing that kind of cost-benefit analysis these days, don't you? The next week, her workmate's fingers are severed and she's sacked. So, that's the reality of what they're dealing with. So when all this gets reported, it's getting awfully embarrassing to be the Bryant family at this point. They've gone from real darlings of the Liberals and friends with government and friends with Gladstone to, nobody will talk to us anymore. Everyone's unfriended us on Facebook. It's awful for them right now. A lot of their shareholders are clergymen and Liberal MPs. Oops. So in their day job, they're saying, oh, the poor, the poor old poor, and look after the poor. And then they're being found to be making all this money, 20% profits off starvation and exploitation and death and disease, and it's all getting very embarrassing. Obviously that couldn't happen now. You wouldn't get MPs now profiting at the expense of their constituents. It's all changed, but this is a long time ago. So this is what puts the pressure on Bryant and May. It isn't that they suddenly, have a Damascus moment and think, gosh, we've been a bit unfair to the old match girls. It's purely because political pressure is being massively applied to them and their share prices are tumbling. So nothing changes, does it? Eventually, they agreed to settle the dispute, absolutely fuming. They were still fuming years later. You can see the correspondence in their company archives. They're really sulky, even no need for a strike, completely unnecessary. Don't mention the strike, it'll set them off again. They go back to work and they win their conditions. They get their separate dining room. It's built over the road. They get the right to form a trade union. It's the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time. It's pretty impressive. And they get wage increases. The girls who were on strike, the 1,400 of them, remain the cool gang for generations. Everyone knows that she was on strike. She's one of the cool ones. When new workers come in, Bryant and May try to pay them lower wages, but the cool gang will say, how much are you getting paid then? No, go and tell them that's wrong. So they're still fighting. Their union's really militant. They go on strike a lot, even though Annie Besant, the strike leader, supposedly, says to them, the last meeting that I found a record of, she says to them, now girls, you're very fortunate. The nice Mr. Bryant has agreed to meet your terms, but he doesn't want you going on strike again. You're not going to, are you? There'll be none of this. You got away with it this time, basically. It's very school mistressy. It's very Lady Bountiful, philanthropic. It's not a kind of rousing socialist speech by any means. But they do go on strike again. Annie Besant is not involved with the union for very long. She becomes a theosophist. Anybody theosophy? Yes, one of my. No one here is a theosophist.
My mother was a theosophist.
Sorry.
My mother was a theosophist.
Oh, she's not here, is she?
No, she's not here. She's probably supporting what you say.
Oh, good, that's all right, because I've got myself in a lot of trouble. Excuse me. Theosophy, interesting religion, bit Scientology. In those days, anyway, I'm sure by the time anyone got to it, it was lots better. But sort of aliens walk amongst us and reincarnation and phrenology and a bit of palmistry and all that kind of stuff. Annie Besant ends up, even though to some she's still a socialist and trade unionist heroine, she ends up a theosophical leader. She's a religious leader. She dies in India, and her body is burned on a funeral pyre on the Ganges. I don't know if Bryant and May match.
Discovered Krishnamurti.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. Whether or not a Bryant and May match lit the funeral pyre, I don't know. I think Bryant and May would have liked to throw her on one in 1888. But that's her, and the idea that she was a strike leader, it's fascinating. But why? Why then? Why has this strike been written off? And does it really matter? I think it does. What happened after the strike was that there were the incidents of strike action, which I have been sad enough to examine personally, incident by incident, goes up massively. Strikes the year before in every quarter are a lot lower. Matchwomen's victory, bam, strikes go through the roof. And not just here. There are accounts of women in Dublin writing to the Matchwomen's Union and saying, we've heard about your victory, can you help us? People like to think at this time, even some historians, that they couldn't really talk to each other, the working classes, because they couldn't really read or write, so they didn't know what was going on. Of course, it's nonsense. They absolutely did know. If you couldn't read, somebody would read a newspaper and you'd all read it out loud in the pub and you'd all listen. Everyone knew exactly what was going on. This victory was not going to be lost on similar groups of workers, and it wasn't going to be lost on the dockers. London dockers, huge body of workers. They are to male labour what the Matchwomen are to female labour. Massive body of casually employed men having to fight every day to get hired. Very little trade union involvement, no rights, no contracts of employment, very dangerous work. And Irish, again, they meet, when the dock strike finally happens in 1889, they meet in the Wade Arms, which is an Irish pub, and the strike committee is full of McCarthys and so forth. It really is a very Irish strike. But this is the big one. The dock strike is the big one for Labour historians, not the Matchwomen strike, even though it happened afterwards. It's almost like, well, yes, thanks very much, dear, we'll wait till the man comes along and does it, and then it's proper. But what historians have written is they couldn't possibly have influenced the new unionist movement, which begins with the dock strikes, is the modern labour movement that we talked about when trade unions start to get political, because they're women, basically. I mean, people do say they're far too different. I mean, they're not men, for one thing. The connections are immense. They're all over the East End. They're living, you only got to look at the census, they're living in dockers and matchwomen live in the same houses, in the same streets, in the same family. Well, they would, wouldn't they? They're all part of the same communities. And actually, the dockers approach the matchwomen 3 months after their victory and they ask for help. And the matchwomen, when the dock strike happens, John Burns, who's the leader of the match strike and goes on to become an MP, is talking to about 100,000 men who are very dispirited. The dock company is not caving in. They've been on a strike, they're starving really quickly. He says, don't give up. Remember the match girls who won their strike and formed a union. And he doesn't say, you know, those women up the road who went on strike last year. He assumes everyone knows exactly what he's talking about, because that's how influential they were. He says a lot more than that. He says that they began the new unionism movement. But historians have somehow managed to go, oh no, but not really, no. No, this can't be right. They've managed to minimise it and talk about it as being a really trivial strike, and they've even, if it's written about at all, and it's actually not in a lot of books about the period, it's completely ignored until my book, which by the way I would take orders for, and it makes an ideal Christmas gift. So mine's the only book that's been written about the matchwomen's strike exclusively, but it's clear that the connections were there. So having removed Annie Besser from the story as the leader, my problem then was some resistance, shall we say, from people saying, but think honestly, this is feminist tokenism of the worst kind. These are just a bunch of uneducated girls. How could they possibly have done anything important, even by mistake? You know, how could they possibly have been, as you are claiming, the mothers of the trade union movement? They were waifs, and you can understand it. That's very much the story that's been handed down to us. It's a very Victorian story. It's Lady Bountiful, you know, comes from on high to rescue the little waifs and strays, and they're, oh bless your mum, and they, you know, they do what they're told. She tells them the Fabian Society has decided they're having a strike, and out they go. And I think it gets confused with Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Match Girl. I think that was a real Victorian nursery classic at the time. And a lot of people do, when they're talking about it, say, oh, the Little Match Girls that you wrote about. I think this image with the Victorians and since has got really confused. They're these tiny little waifs, and they're very sweet and helpless and a bit thick. And they need a nice middle-class person to lead them. So I had to go back to the East End as much as I could. Obviously, these women are dead. A lot of them couldn't write their life stories. It's a common problem that there aren't records, there aren't diaries of working class women. Why? Because they were working and having 10 babies. They didn't really have time to sort of do a lap of one around the East End and write about their glorious victory. So I had to go back as far as I could and look at accounts that were written by people at the time, and eventually trace their grandchildren as well, which was fantastic. When I actually finally managed to crack that against all advice from proper historians who said that's a ridiculous idea, that won't work. So the matchwomen were really famous in the East End, actually, even before the strike. They were, as we said before, your archetypal factory girls. They walked to work and they swept down the Bow Road in these huge gangs, arm in arm, and you did not mess with the matchwomen. You got out of the way politely. Some people used to know when their shift patterns were, because if you had children, if you were a respectable East Ender, you didn't really want to be out on the streets when they came off shift because of the language and the behaviour. You didn't want to witness any of that, so people imagine people ushering, oh my God, you know, the match factory is coming out, quickly everybody run, hide, get inside, it's the matchwomen. They were very tough, they had to be very tough. In those days you did, what were the living conditions, you know, death rates, all incredibly horrific. And the East End's pretty violent as well. There's not a lot of street lighting, it's particularly violent after dark. The matchwomen had their own ways around this, though. They had their own uniforms, their own style and sense of fashion. Oh, hello. What was that? I've done it with the power of my mind.
It's probably just because it's been sitting there for a while.
Yeah, so it's like you probably are, it's probably starting to run off a little bit. Yes, so they're got their own styles and fashions. They had fringes, which were quite unusual. You can see Annie Besant doesn't have a fringe. That's quite a revolutionary style. They wore very bright clothes. When they were out of work and putting on their Sunday best to go to the music hall, they wore really bright clothes that were really bling, and I'm afraid this was not good for the middle class. And if you have to be poor, you know, if you must be on the streets, at least wear beige or something. Don't be there with your bling and your enormous hats. And hats were very much the thing for them. They couldn't afford their own, so they paid into what they call feather clubs, and they bought communal hats. So you put in a penny of your wages. When you had enough money, Ethel would go off to the milliners and come back with a hat. And again, wrong sort of hat, great big hat, big coloured feathers, terrible, really tacky. Didn't not liked at all by the middle classes, but I think they must have looked absolutely fantastic. And there's a line in the newspaper reporting the dock strike victory procession saying, and after the dockers, up came the match girls advancing like a moving rainbow of many colours, because they all had these incredible hats on. Now, what the hats meant was that they also had, if you have a big hat, you have a big hat pin. It sounds like a euphemism, but it literally. So they were dressed to kill. So if anybody did try to mess with them, you know, they were pretty well armed. When I met descendants, I got some great stories. I got one story from a chap called Jim Best, who was a London cabbie, and his grandmother might even have been Eliza, who began the strike. And he said that most of the East End women had to be tough. They had to, there's a lot of assault, violence, sexual assault going on. You had to be able to protect your family women, your girls, when you were out together. That's why they travelled in gangs. And he said once his grandma was in the bookies queuing up to place her bet. And a toff came in, you know, somebody upper class, that was really unusual in the East End, sort of top hat, came and stood behind her. And the local lads thought, all right, an opportunity for a bit of fun here. So one of them snuck up, reached round poor unfortunate Toff, pinched Grandma's bum, I'm afraid. Grandma asks no questions, turns round, leading fist first, and knocks the guy out with one punch. They were not women that you messed with. After the strike and after they went back to work, they even got a death threat, or an apparent death threat, from Jack the Ripper. A letter was delivered at the factory saying, I'm going to pay your working girls a visit and I'm going to see what they have in their stomachs. I'm going to take it out of them, how delightful, signed J. Ripper. Now, whether it was fake or not, what I love about that is what he says. They are beginning to say what they will do with me. So where most people are quite understandably terrified, 5 women have died, you know, dark streets of Whitechapel and so forth, they're saying, right, wait till we get our eyes on him. And I wish they had. I think it would have been a lot less deaths. I would put my money on Matchwomen with hat pins at the resi against Jack the Ripper any day. Interestingly, having met the grandchildren, which was a very long process, but I ended up a talk I did at the Museum of London years ago with this slide, and a woman came up and said, I'm sorry to bother you, but I think that's my grandmother there. Lock the doors, don't let this woman get away. Because I've been trying for years through census and doing radio stuff.
So which one?
This woman here, Mary Driscoll, that's her sister, Polly. Amazing woman. She's in the first picture of the girls as well. A lot of these women are the same, but they look really different. In the first picture, they've just gone on strike. And see if I can get back to it without wrecking tech. They've just gone on strike. That's Mary there. You know, they're very anxious about the future. They're not used to having their photo taken. They've been working since 6 in the morning. They're knackered. They've got their work clothes on, and they do look a bit anxious. But in this one, it's not that much later, but we've been in the papers, thank you very much, and we're doing rather well here. They've actually, at this point, they've gone and met with MPs and impressed MPs with their eloquence. The MPs have taken grief, you know, they can form whole sentences and everything. And they're quite something now in the East End. The tide's beginning to turn, and they're really proud of themselves. I think you can see that. Plus, they know they're having their photo taken, so they've done their hair. They've probably got their best dress out of the pawn shop for the day. So that's Mary. Mary in the first photograph as well, and in every photograph subsequently that I've seen of those two women into their 60s, they're always in that pose. One's always got a hand on the other one's shoulder. They were incredibly close. They come from Cork, they're Irish women, very strong women. Joan, the granddaughter, got a good laugh out of the idea that Matchwomen would have been told what to do by Annie Best, and she thought that was kind of hilarious. Nobody told my grandma what to do, you must be joking. Mary was known for being a respected woman in her street. She was the one you went to as a midwife, which was very common with a lot of these women on the strike committee, actually. They were the community leaders, if you like, as they would say, the community leaders said. And they would lay out the dead. She personally would, and a lot of these women would. That was what your respected women did. I met 2 other chaps as well who'd known their grandmothers. I was so lucky. I knew I had to do it now. There wasn't going to be anyone left who was A, alive, or B, loose enough to remember or had known these women, but I was extremely lucky. And they all said they were incredibly strong women. They knew their own minds. One of them said, well, I was always a trade unionist because of my grandma, because I saw her working so hard, because I understood the hardships of her life, and because she told me to be. And you didn't argue with her. She said, remember whose side you're on, remember whose side your employers are on. And the same with Mary as well. She loved her rebel songs. She used to, always after a few gins, and she did like a few gins, most of them did, she would sing rebel songs from Ireland. And all of them really messed around with gender norms. They did not live how respectable Victorian ladies were supposed to live at all. But they got away with it somehow. They even took lovers. The grandchildren were quite open about this. I said, well, how did Mary go on to run a shop? Well, dear, she had some gentleman friends. And yeah, they did really well. But as one of them said about his grandmother Martha, she got about it. She had a good time. This was surprisingly okay if you were tough enough to front it out. Mrs. Coventry Patmore, meanwhile, is fainting at the very idea of it. Horrifying, this idea. But at the other end of town, if you can front it out and you're tough enough, and people see that you're a good community leader and you're a good matriarch, it's amazing. There's this whole other life that's going on. And speaking of Mrs. Coventry Patmore, I always like to think of her when this magistrate talks about the Matchwomen. And I imagine her embroidering by the fire as the proper Victorian woman. And a magistrate says, oh, don't talk to me about the Matchwomen. They wake me up pretty much every night on a bank holiday because they go out to the music halls and they come home and you can hear them all through the streets singing Nottingham the Old Kent Road and Tarara Bundier. They know all the music hall songs, and quite frankly they wake me up and says, it's a little disturbing for quiet loving citizens. After the strike, they don't just rest on their laurels. They've won this incredible victory. Everyone is astonished. The newspapers say this is the most incredible victory. Nobody expected this to happen. Not content with that, with having started basically the new union movement and the Labour Party, effectively, because that comes out of this. They don't rest on their laurels. They go and they constantly recruit and they constantly organise. And the Women's Trade Union League, who are a middle-class organisation, there's a terrible problem with working-class men not organising within workers at this time. They're absolutely run ragged. I've read their diaries. They're like, it's those match girls again. They want us to have another meeting. They want another hall. And they want us to book an Irish musician. And it's difficult at short notice. I know. I did a festival. It is difficult. I do sympathise. And, we've got to get tea and cakes. And they want to talk to the dockers' wives. They want to talk to the jam makers. They want to talk to the confectionery girls. They're unionising like mad. They're doing absolutely everything they're not supposed to be doing as poor and working class women. To me, they're an incredible example. They are not the only ones. There are thousands of women like this. There have been throughout history, and there will always be hundreds of thousands. For every Matchwomen strike, there are 100 at least that we don't know about at the same period that haven't been studied. I use them because they're a great example, because they do mess around with gender norms so much. They do everything Victorian women are not supposed to do. They break all the rules, and in doing so, they change the world for working people. That's why I have a festival every year, and it will be on the 4th of July next year, and do all come along to it. I think they need celebrating. I go into schools as well. It's so important, I think, to talk to children and give them strong role models that aren't just Winston Churchill and Henry VIII, which tends to be no disrespect to David Starkey. Some disrespect to David Starkey. But that's what we tend to get from mainstream history, and that's not terribly exciting if you're a sort of hackney teenager. It doesn't really speak to you. So I think they're fantastic role models and a lot better than celebrities who've lost £10 and married a footballer. I think they're really important in showing what basically teenage girls can achieve. So all that remains for me to say is, if those are bad girls, then here's to the bad girls. Thank you.